The villagers of St. Ilvaran used to say that faith was a door you opened, never one that closed. They believed a chapel should breathe with its people, its doors resting wide at all hours, as though God himself needed the night air no less than men. For generations, the old stone church at the village centre had stood unlocked, through wars, through winters, through every grief and harvest. A sanctuary that never barred itself against its own flock. But that was before the first night the bolts slid shut on their own. The church stood on an old foundation, older than memory, older than parchment records, older than the village that clung to it like moss to stone. No one alive remembered its builders. No one knew why the floor sloped slightly downward, or why the altar had been raised not before windows of morning light, but before a wall that drank every candle's flame and never reflected it. The priest, Father Mathieu, accepted such mysteries the way old priests do, with a quiet shrug and a hope that faith would answer what history would not. The evening it began. The sun died behind the hills like a snuffed taper, and the chapel doors still stood open for late prayers. A handful of villagers lingered beneath the sinking hush of vespers, their voices still trembling from the final amen. No wind moved, no animal stirred, not even the ravens that haunted the steeple. The air felt strangely thick, as though something unseen strained to breathe through it. Then came the first sound. Iron shifting against iron. At first it was gentle, like a latch being tested. The congregation turned toward the open doors, puzzled but unafraid. But then came the second sound, sharper and deliberate, echoing against stone. The heavy wooden doors trembled, as though grasped by unseen hands, and, before any villager moved to intervene, the great bronze bolts slid forward, grinding into place with a force no single person could have mustered. The doors sealed themselves shut. Someone ran forward, thinking perhaps a gust had slammed them and found them immovable. The handles were cold to the touch, colder than iron should be in summer. The villagers stared, waiting for Father Mathieu to speak, to explain, to unwrap this moment with scripture or sense. But even he only stared at the sealed entrance, his lips parted around a prayer that would not commit to breath. In silence, the lock held. No word passed between the gathered souls as the candles burned lower. The priest tried once more to pull the bar free, but it was as though the bolt had fused into the stone. When he stepped back, a chill rippled through the small assembly. For the first time, someone whispered the question that would haunt the days to follow. Who locked it? Night settled across the village like a burial cloth. The people dispersed, each returning to their homes with unease gnawing through their thoughts. The church stood sealed until morning, and when dawn broke, they found the doors open once more, bolts retracted, the sanctuary waiting as though nothing had occurred. Father Mathieu insisted on calm. A mechanical fault, he told them, a trick of wood and temperature. But even he avoided the doors that evening, choosing to pray further from their hinges, as though distance could soften dread. The second night came, when the last villager whispered a prayer and departed. Father Mathieu remained behind with a lantern and a stubborn shred of confidence. He would watch, he would witness, he would understand. Midnight approached with claws of silence. The priest's breath echoed softly through the nave as he paced before the altar, lantern swaying, shadows bending in long, crooked shapes across the floor. Then it began again. The bolts stirred like waking serpents, shivering in their mounts. Father Mathieu froze. His lantern dimmed, as though its flame suddenly feared illumination. His heart hammered against his ribs as the great doors quivered under a pressure that came from within, not from the wind, not from the world, but from the dark itself. The iron swung forward and sealed the doors once more, locking him inside the house of God. He did not sleep that night. He prayed until dawn came, and the doors of their own accord unlocked with a gentle sigh, as though releasing a held breath. By the third night, the villagers refused to remain after sunset. No candle stayed lit inside. The chapel belonged to daylight alone, and when dusk returned, every soul in St. Ilvaron hurried home before the final bell. Yet still, as predictably as the turning of the stars, the doors sealed themselves. Frightened rumors took root like rot beneath floorboards. Some claimed it was God's warning. Others whispered that the church had never been a sanctuary at all, that its builders had not raised it to let heaven in, but to keep something else contained. And then came the voices. On the seventh night, a shepherd walking home past the chapel heard soft murmurs spilling through the sealed door. Not one voice, but many, layered, tangled, weaving through the dark like threads pulled from forgotten throats. They weren't praying. They sounded as though they were remembering, whispering, repeating fragments of language older than Scripture, older than Latin, older than breath. No one dared go near after that. Father Mathieu remained outwardly firm, but his face changed. His eyes carried sleepless hollows. He walked with shoulders bent, listening for something the rest could not hear. When asked what troubled him, he spoke only of duty, of faith, of perseverance. But one child swore she heard him muttering a different sentence under his breath as he passed, words she later repeated, though no one wanted to believe her. It wasn't trying to get out, he whispered. It was trying to wake up. The nights that followed bruised the village with dread. No one slept easily. No one walked the square after dusk. Even animals kept their distance from the chapel, circling wide as though the earth itself warned them away. The church that had once been their refuge now loomed like a sentinel or a tomb. Then, on the 13th night, Father Mathieu did not return home. His lantern was found guttering at the threshold. The doors were sealed hours before the final bell, and from within the church, someone or something began to breathe. Slow, steady, patient, as though waiting for the moment the world grew quiet enough to hear. Mourning in St. Ilvaron became a ritual of pretending. The villagers opened their shutters, swept their steps, tended their animals, and forced themselves to speak of weather, harvest, and bread. Anything but the church. Anything but the 13th night. But every face carried the same unspoken question: where was Father Mathieu? At first light, a small search formed. 5 men, each armed with nothing more than lanterns, trembling resolve, and a stubborn belief that daylight could not betray them the way night had. The church doors stood open again, gentle and innocently parted, as though they had never known iron, lock, or violence. Inside, the air tasted strangely metallic. The nave was empty, yet not silent. The stone walls held a hush that felt thicker than quiet, as if sound itself had weight. Dust floated in still beams of morning light, settling across pews like frost. No sign of struggle lay in sight, no imprint of a fallen body, and yet the men refused to step farther than the first row. Something about the center aisle felt wrong, like a throat waiting to swallow. They called for the priest, no answer. By noon, whispers spread like mildew behind closed doors. Some villagers claimed to see shapes moving past the church windows at night. Others swore they heard chanting from below the floorboards. Mothers kept their children indoors. The blacksmith shut his forge at midday. Even the ravens abandoned the steeple. On the second morning after Mathieu's disappearance, the oldest resident of St. Ilvaron, Sister Merelda, demanded the records be opened. She had lived more winters than any soul in the village, her back bent like a bow, and her eyes smeared with cataract haze, but her voice still carried the brittle command of someone who had once feared nothing. In her youth, she had been the church archivist, the last to care for its oldest papers before arthritis turned her hands to stone. The villagers resisted at first. Old archives meant old secrets, and secrets were no longer harmless things. But she would not be denied. She ordered them to bring the locked chest from the rectory, the one sealed since before most of them were born. Reluctantly, they obeyed. When the chest was opened, the villagers found brittle vellum ledgers, rotted ribbon-bound notes, a handful of strange iron keys, and scrolls marked with symbols no one recognized. Sister Merelda worked through them with trembling fingers, sorting parchment from parchment, whispering to herself, frowning deeper with each page. It was hours before she finally leaned back in her chair, breath hollowing out of her. She told them the church had been built on top of something, not over ruins, not over graves, something deeper. A sub-foundation referenced only once in a letter dated centuries earlier, a warning written by a prior whose name she did not recognize. The letter spoke of a chamber beneath the altar and an opening beneath that chamber, something sealed, buried, and warded with hymn and stone. She traced lines of ink that shook her old voice into a whisper. It must not wake. Should the seal weaken, the sanctuary must close itself against the night. The villagers went silent, because that meant the church was not malfunctioning. It was doing what it was built to do. That evening, as the sun bled across the fields, a small group gathered outside the chapel with tools, rope, and oil lamps. Not the naive bravado of rescuers, no illusions remained of saving anyone, but the grim determination of people who needed truth more than safety. They entered before dusk. 10 paces in, the air turned colder. Shadows clung to corners unnaturally, refusing to yield even to lamplight. Sister Merelda directed them to the altar. She insisted there would be a hidden mechanism, a stone plate, something concealed in plain sight. They searched. At last, beneath the altar cloth, they found it, a faint seam in the stone, forming a square barely visible beneath centuries of candle wax and dust. With chisels and crowbars, they pried it open. The altar groaned, the stone lifted, and beneath it yawned a stairway, spiraling down into breathless dark. A smell rose up to meet them, not rot, not earth, but something older, like air that had never known the sky, holding memory instead of oxygen. One villager gagged. Another stepped back, ready to seal the stairs and flee. But Sister Merelda took the first step downward, clutching her lantern before her like a frail shield. The stairs descended deeper than any church cellar should have existed. The walls bore carvings, not crosses, not saints, but twisting sigils with no beginning and no end. The group spoke little. Some bit their tongues to keep from praying, afraid prayer might be heard by the wrong ears. At the bottom stood a narrow corridor, and beyond that, a chamber. No one entered at first. The threshold itself felt predatory, but when they finally forced themselves in, they raised their lamps and saw it. A vast, circular room beneath the foundation, older than the chapel, older than the village, older than language they knew. In its center lay a seal of iron set into stone, ringed with symbols that pulsed as if remembering each flame that approached. Beside it, on the dusty ground, a lantern. Father Mathieu's lantern, still upright, still warm. But there was no priest, only footprints that led to the iron seal, then vanished. No return prints, no scuff, no drag, as if the priest had simply ceased to exist at the very center of the chamber. One villager tried to speak, but his voice collapsed. Another dropped his lamp, and when he knelt to retrieve it, he whispered that the iron plate beneath him felt warm, warmer than skin. Sister Merelda stared at the seal and understood before any of them dared name it. The doors above did not lock to keep something inside the church. They locked because something below was closest to the surface at night. Something aware, something listening. They fled the chamber. They sealed the altar. They barred the church from the outside. And when the final bell tolled, every villager hid behind locked shutters, waiting for the bolts to scream shut of their own accord, as they had for 13 nights before. Only this time, the church did not lock, and that was far worse, because if the doors did not lock themselves, it meant they no longer needed to. Something had changed, something was awake, and the villagers of Saint Ilvaron began to understand, too late, that the doors had never been meant to keep them out. They had been the ones trapped outside the cage, and the cage was opening. Night returned to Gethsemane Hollow like a closing hand, and the villagers felt it before they saw it. A tension in the air, a hush in the trees, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Elena tried to convince herself that part 2 was only exhaustion, only grief, only imagination, but her heartbeat betrayed her. She had noticed it first. The church did not sit in the landscape like a building. It waited in it, like a sleeper that listened through its dreams. The lock clicked at sundown again, and again no one had approached the door. No steps in the dew, no lantern, no rope, no sign of any earthly hand. Yet each dusk the bolts slid home, sealing the nave, the altar, the pews, and the silent pulpit. The villagers gathered further away now, no longer daring to pass the iron gate once the sky dimmed. Some homes barred their shutters early, as if the darkness itself had become a contagion that might seep through the cracks. The nights grew heavier, and dreams began to change. One by one, without confessing it aloud, they started to see the same images. A hallway of stone, a candle that never melted, a shape kneeling behind a closed door, and always the sound. A slow rhythmical lull like breath drawn through wood. It followed them into sleep and waited for them in waking silence. By the 5th night, even the strongest men hesitated to stare too long at the steeple. Elena's brother sat at the table, exhausted, though he had slept for hours. Her mother dropped plates. The air felt thick, knees buckled easily. Something unseen leaned on hearts and lungs like weight. The priest's absence became a second voice in the village, a missing sound that made every other sound louder. With each sunset, the church pulsed in their periphery, growing more like a presence than a building of stone and oak. They stopped ringing the bell. Even birds stopped perching on the roof. When wind touched the chapel walls, it did not howl. It murmured, as though entering hollow passages behind the bricks, finding unseen hollows and breathing them awake. Elena could not stop thinking of the lock. She had watched her father approach the door once before he grew afraid. He checked the hinges, tested the bolt, pressed his ear to the grain. He returned pale, refusing to repeat what he had heard. After that, the villagers warned one another not to get close when the sun lowered. It was not superstition. It was instinct, deep and ancestral. Something old and unseen was watching through the wood, and every animal in the valley seemed to understand before the humans did. The church began responding to sound. That was when Elena knew the village would break. A dropped bucket, a child's sob, a slammed window. Any sudden noise near the chapel made the old timbers creak and settle in reply, like lungs adjusting or a sleeper rolling over in bed. At first the villagers told themselves it was only temperature, only old beams and old mortar. But then came the breath, long, low and steady, drifting from the cracks beneath the bolted door. Elena lay awake on the 6th night, staring at her ceiling, her mind circling the same question. Why does the church lock itself? Who or what is it keeping inside? The dreams were worse now. Sleep pulled her under like deep water, and she drifted into that same shared hallway, narrow, candlelit, endless. She followed the breathing to the same door, always closed, always marked by a flickering shadow on the other side. Each dream ended the same way. She reached out to touch the wood, and the door exhaled. By morning she woke gasping, rosary tangled in her fist. She told no one. Shame and fear braided together, and silence became its own ritual. The villagers pretended at normalcy by day, but their eyes betrayed them. They avoided each other's gaze, afraid to see their own terror reflected back. The children stopped playing near the chapel wall. Livestock refused to graze on the slope where the church shadow fell at dusk. Even the well water tasted different, metallic, as though the ground itself had begun remembering something it once swore to forget. The seventh night broke the village's last thread of denial. The church responded not only to sound, but to silence. When the valley fell quiet, an answering quiet pressed outward from the sanctuary. It was a heavier kind of silence, the silence of breath being held, waiting, listening, anticipating. The villagers lay in their beds, suffocating under that stillness, and in the depth of midnight the walls began to pulse. A soft wooden thudding like a heartbeat buried in the grain. Elena rose, drawn to her window with trembling steps. She could not look away. The church door glistened as though damp, and she realized with crushing clarity that the building was alive in some way that defied her world and her God. Not haunted, not possessed, alive, and if it was alive, then it could hunger. And if it could hunger, then the lock was not a barrier at all. It was a jaw. The valley had one more day before something broke. And she knew, with dread that hollowed her to the bone, that the church no longer waited for night to breathe. Night deepened over Gethsemane Hollow, until even the moon refused to linger, and the village lay beneath a sky as blank as slate. Elena remained at her window, unable to turn away from the church, no matter how fiercely her instincts pleaded for retreat. The building stood silent, yet its stillness carried intention, as though it timed each moment according to a breath too slow and ancient for human lungs. The lock gleamed faintly in what little light remained, slick as though kissed by dew, though the ground around it was dry. She watched and waited and felt the heaviness of a presence that no longer cared to hide its awareness. The villagers had scattered into uneasy sleep, or something close to it, restless tossing, shallow breaths, minds half awake in dread. Elena felt the same pull. Her eyelids weakened. But each time she began to drift, the church answered with a sound, a wooden shift, a sigh through the boards, a hush that rippled through the earth and climbed her spine. Sleep became a negotiation. She feared that closing her eyes would allow the building to move closer, in ways waking senses might catch, but sleeping senses would never stop. Eventually she stepped back from the window, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The air inside her home felt colder than the night beyond the glass. She lay in bed, rigid and alert, and stared at the ceiling until her vision blurred. When sleep finally claimed her, it was not a surrender but an ambush. She fell inward as though pulled through the floorboards, and found herself once again in the corridor that had haunted every dream since the church first sealed itself. The same candle burned, its flame motionless despite an unseen current in the air. The stones of the hallway seemed damp, reflecting a sheen like sweat, and the breathing, steady, patient, echoed from somewhere ahead. She knew the door waited at the end, hidden in shadow. Each dream brought her a step closer, and now only a few paces remained. She tried to halt her feet, but dreams respected no command of will. The stones chilled her bare soul, her pulse hammered, and the breath on the other side of the wood no longer sounded distant. It was near, too near, slowed to match her heartbeat. She reached the door. A thin band of light traced the bottom edge, and for a moment she believed she could see shapes move inside. Her hand lifted against her will, her palm pressing to the wood. Beneath it, warmth, a pulse, living grain. She felt the breath answer her touch, as though the church recognized the contact. Instead of recoiling, the dream carried her closer. Her forehead rested against the door. The wood exhaled. The candle extinguished. Darkness swallowed everything. She woke choking on a gasp. Sunlight had broken over the valley, but the warmth of it did nothing to ease her shaking limbs. Her sheets were damp with sweat, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Dreams like that should have evaporated at waking, but this one clung, clear as memory. She slipped from the bed, splashed her face with cold water and stared at her reflection. Shadows pooled under her eyes. She felt thinner, though she had eaten. Watched. She felt watched. Outside, the village moved through morning rituals in silence. Doors opened, tools were lifted, bread was baked, but conversation was sparse. Eyes wandered to the church, then away, ashamed of their own fear. Parents kept children close. Men avoided the chapel path entirely. Only one man dared stand at the edge of the gate, staring up at the steeple as though attempting to reclaim control through sheer defiance. Eleanor recognized him. Anton, the blacksmith's son who prided himself on fearing nothing. But even from a distance she saw the tremor in his stance. He left the gate quickly. The day passed with no comfort. Animals refused to drink from the trough nearest the church. A cow bellowed until moved to a distant field. Birds flew wide arcs around the steeple. Even insects avoided the grass beside the chapel wall. By late afternoon, the villagers communicated through glances, a silent agreement growing among them. The church no longer merely existed in their valley, it imposed itself upon it. That evening, Elena joined a small gathering at the well. The faces around her were pale, sleepless, and drawn. Someone muttered that the lock must be broken open. Another whispered of setting fire to the door. A third urged prayer, though the word trembled in the air, stripped of conviction. No plan solidified. Twilight approached, and dread scattered the crowd before the sky even darkened. They hurried home, leaving questions unanswered, leaving the church unchallenged. No one wished to stand near it after the sun was gone. Night fell. The lock slid shut. Elena jolted upright at the sound, even though she had expected it. The click was louder now. Not metallic, wet, heavy, like a tongue pressed to teeth. She lit a candle, unable to sit in darkness. But as soon as the flame rose, she heard it, the breathing in the silence. Not from the church this time, from the walls of her house. The wood inhaled, slow and deep, as though distant lungs expanded through the beams. She pressed her ear to the planks. The breathing continued, steady and patient everywhere and nowhere at once, as though the church had extended itself, as though anything made of timber belonged to it, as though the valley was becoming part of its body. Sleep did not come. When her eyes finally closed, she dreamed not of a hallway, but of the church interior itself. Empty pews glowing in candlelight. Shadows arched across the ceiling, and the door at the front of the nave. The same door from her vision, marked by the same light beneath it. Closer now, always closer. The breathing grew louder, the door waited, and morning would not save them much longer. The breathing in the walls did not stop with the first night. It learned cadence as people learned to be afraid. At first, it was a nuance. A pause in the wind that felt shaped, a timbre to the timber that answered when someone spoke too loudly. Then it began to pattern itself to the lives that orbited it. The low, slow draw that matched the village's old clock. A shorter lift that imitated a child's sob. A long exhale that fell like a sigh from a mother's chest. The building tuned itself to anything that came near, and made of it a new language the villagers could not yet speak. By the fourth night after the chamber was discovered, sleep unstitched entirely. Husbands woke at the same hour, hands reaching for nothing. Dogs paced in perfect circles. Neighbors dreamt the same corridor. Priests in distant parishes dreamed it too, though none would speak of why their fingers cramped with guilt the next morning. People began to wake with the memory of footsteps on their floors that were not their own, the pressure of breath across the backs of their necks. In the smithy, a boy named Pierre found his hammer cold and heavy in his hand at midnight, as if he had been working of his own accord. He would not remember when he had struck the iron. He only knew, with the kind of certainty that makes men confess to strangers, that a hand had guided his wrist. They learned the church listened not only for noise, but for pattern. When a morning bell tolled, the timbers answered with a hollow that changed the bell's note into a minor sound that left people's mouths bitter. When someone recited the Lord's Prayer aloud in defiance, the planks below them matched cadence and then diverged, forming a counter-chant that set their teeth on edge. The more the villagers resisted, the more the building learned their words, until what began as submission turned into mimicry, and mimicry into a memory no one owned. Elena found herself cataloguing each new small terror like a ledger, writing it in the margin of her mind the way the old nuns once annotated psalms. Windows would fog from within, though the air was dry. Mirrors clouded only at night and cleared by morning, leaving no explanation but the sensation of being watched by one's reflection. Bread baked in ovens across the hollow would sour overnight, though no mold showed. Plates would crack once placed on tables, a web of fissures mimicking the veins of leaves. The tenderest violations were the most corrosive. A child's toy would be found on a roof. A man's boot would be replaced by someone else's. No one accused neighbors. Blame had nowhere to anchor, but suspicion pooled like rainwater behind shut doors. They tried to counter the pattern. They sang hymns in fields where the church could not hear. They rang bells in defiance, pounding iron until the clapper broke free. For a night, the chapel answered by falling silent, and hope flared in bellies like a fever. But the next afternoon, the silence arrived in a different voice. The well beside the green went dry for an hour, then gushed black water that stank of iron. The village asked whether they had won or lost. No one could say. On the 9th dusk, a small band gathered at the gate. Not the men who would have once marched with torches and pitchforks, but people whose fear had become a steady ember, women who had learned endurance, an old teacher with arthritis, a boy whose mother sent him because children hear what adults hide. They moved like petitioners, carrying rosaries and scraps of paper where names had been written and then crossed out and rewritten. They did not plan to break the doors. They came to listen. They pressed their faces close to the wood. The planks were warm, not from sun nor summer, but as if the grain itself held a slow fever. A murmur shivered through the seams like breath escaping through a straw. The church answered them in sounds that were not quite language, a susurration of vowels that felt as if placed just behind the ear. One woman swore she heard her own name, the syllable a pebble rolled across a shallow stream. She stumbled back, clutching her throat, and the others saw that her hands were trembling, that tears had made tracks through the dust on her cheeks. They could not tell if the church called the names or remembered them. Memory and summoning braided together in the same voice. A child began to recite in the hush after a list of surnames, long families that had lived in the hollow for centuries, some dead, some forgotten. The boy spoke them as if reading a roll taken at a calling of names. When he named a family that had left in an old famine, a caravan of crows settled on the chapel roof and did not fly for 3 days. Enough small cruelties defiled the ordinary, that the old stories emerged, tales that people laughed at as children and refused to repeat as adults. The builder priests who first raised the church had not been fools to their craft. They had known a thing beneath their feet that wanted listening. They had made a place that could hear and, if necessary, shut itself when that thing stirred, trapping it not only beneath stone, but behind the rituals that fed the seal. The ledger in Sister Merelda's clutch hinted at hymns older than the Western rites, measures chanted in a pattern that doubled as binding. Over time, the knowledge turned to liturgy, and then to quiet habit, and the original intent degraded into superstition. But the seal remained, or had, until Father Mathieu disappeared and the iron learned to move without prompting. What the villagers feared most was not the thing below, nor the church as its mouth. It was the possibility that the building's appetite might one night seek to widen. The first signs of hunger were domestic and almost tender. Someone's cat wandered into a garden and would not return. A widow who slept near the chapel woke to find the rosary in her hands gone, and the string of the neighbor's horse tied around her neck like a collar. A baby was born with eyes milky and unfocused, and in the night its cry resonated with the chapel's hollow thrum, as though answering a rite. People began to disappear in the daylight. Not the stolen vanishings of thieves, but the slow absences that left behind context like a missing stitch. A baker would step outside and find himself several hours later at the gate of the church with his apron clean and no recollection of the path. He was not harmed. He worked again the next morning, but sometimes, when the villagers passed him, they felt as if the air around him had shifted, as if his presence carried with it a faint echo of someone who had passed through a place of worship and not returned the same. Rumors hardened into theory. The seal did not only keep something in, it also remembered. The patterns the villagers made, their prayers, their grief, their names, were lodged like fossils within whatever presence slumbered below. When the chapel listened, it learned which names mattered. It stitched them into its breathing until the boundary between remembrance and hunger blurred. No one could agree on one thing, whether the church acted out of malice or duty. That debate felt useless to Elena as winter narrowed the days. She had begun to notice that the more someone tried to leave St. Ilveron, the colder the road became beneath their feet. Travelers paused on the ridge and turned back inexplicably. A merchant who had planned to move goods past the hollow sold his cart at a loss and left with no explanation. People joked about weather and stubbornness, but the jokes came with the same thin smiles that had replaced singing. On the 12th night after Father Mathieu's lantern was found, a boy named Louis, thin, brave in the way only children are brave, was seen walking toward the church at dusk. He moved with the slow gait of someone neither asleep nor fully awake. Mothers cried and ran after him, but he did not hear. He reached the gate and pressed his small hands to the wood. The church breathed in response, and, in that breath, the boy closed his eyes as if listening to his own name, called by another world. He did not enter. He walked back, smiling, as if granted a secret. That was when everything shifted from rumor to fact. The following morning, Louis's mother could not find him. His bed lay empty. No footprints led away. No tracks circled the yard. For 3 days the village searched and raised prayers and placed candles at thresholds. No sign of him appeared, and yet sometimes in market or at the well, people swore they saw the boy at the edge of the green, laughing where no noise could be heard, moving his lips with some silent litany. He became a kind of omen, half lost, half returned, a caution against looking too long at the place that did not truly belong to them. In the weeks that followed, the village began to divide. Some insisted on staying, certain they could appease what lay beneath with offerings, with old songs, with ever more fervent prayer. They argued that the seal must be tended, that the original hymns must be sung again, louder, truer, until whatever slept below would be content to remain. Others argued for flight, for leaving the hollow entirely and taking with them the terrible memory of a parish that had become a mouth. The debate ate at the town as the breathing ate at the night. And above all this, in the heart of the village, the church listened and learned and breathed, patient as a thing that knows time in centuries. It had been fashioned as a lock. Now it practiced the opening of locks. The air around it thickened, and the valley answered in thin, human ways, smiles that did not reach eyes, a reluctance to close doors at night, the sudden habit of speaking names under breath.